On a winter evening in Moscow, the city glowed through the glass walls of the office tower in Moscow City. Cars moved in slow streams far below, their headlights smeared into pale lines. Inside, on the top floor, everything was warm light, polished stone, and quiet security. Viktor Lebedev stood at the edge of his office, looking down on the city that had once seemed unreachable. He could see his reflection in the window, middle-aged, well-kept, a man who had spent 2 decades turning numbers into buildings, loans into control, signatures into power. Behind him, an assistant collected empty champagne flutes from a low table. The traces of a celebration still hung in the air, the smell of expensive alcohol, crumbs from catered food, a forgotten folder with a printed presentation about a new infrastructure fund. On the last slide, glossy renderings showed a highway and an industrial park that did not yet exist anywhere except on paper and in the minds of those who wanted to believe in them. For Victor, the evening felt like any other victory. The fund had closed ahead of schedule. Pension funds and private investors had subscribed with almost hysterical eagerness. There had been applause when the last signatures were collected. Someone had tried to thank him personally. He had nodded out of habit and moved on. Gratitude had stopped affecting him years ago. What mattered now was the scale of the capital under his control, and the feeling that, again, he had been faster, smarter, and colder than everyone else in the room. On his desk lay a printed summary, commitments worth tens of billions of rubles, leverage lined up with banks that trusted his name, projected returns that looked ambitious, but not entirely insane. In reality, the objects behind these projections were thin air. The projects were wrappers, shells around a hole. The numbers were paths leading to other companies, then to other jurisdictions, then to balances that no one except Victor and 2 trusted specialists could trace in full. He had not started his career with such plans. Years earlier, a younger version of him had worked in a regional bank, sorting through loan applications and worrying about his own rent. Back then, he had believed in transparent deals and careful risk analysis. Over time, as he moved to Moscow, climbed through positions, and discovered how easily rules could bend for those who knew whom to call, his faith in fairness had thinned. What remained was a fixation on winning. If someone lost in the process, it felt to him like a necessary side effect. That night, alone after everyone left, he opened his laptop and checked a secure folder. A confidential memo appeared on the screen. Internal notes from a small team of analysts about the fund and its so-called anchor project. The memo made it clear that the construction of the industrial park had only a symbolic chance of ever starting. Land rights were under dispute. The supposed contractor was a company with 10 employees and borrowed assets in its portfolio. For a regular investor, the risk would look unacceptable. For Victor, it looked like an ideal mask. He reviewed the planned movement of funds. Subscriptions would go into the fund's account, then be split into loans to a chain of special entities. These entities would pay fake consultants, acquire shares in obscure ventures, send money abroad, and redistribute it through several returning cycles under different labels. At the end, enough of the capital would be parked in discrete places, safe from regulators and the impatient questions of investors. The rest would remain visible and alive in the balance sheets, paying modest interest and drawing attention away from the gap. He had asked himself a year earlier whether this crossed a line that would be impossible to defend. The answer had been simple. He had already crossed it with a previous fund, only in a smaller volume. The scheme had not collapsed. The checks had passed. Auditors had accepted the documentation they were given. The regulator had issued a few written requests, received thick envelopes of explanations, and moved on to other cases. Each time the system tolerated his choices, his sense of risk shrank and his sense of invincibility grew. The next morning, his driver waited in the underground parking. The ride from his gated community to Moscow City passed through light morning traffic. Victor scrolled through news on his phone. The main page of a financial portal showed his photograph next to a headline about the successful closing of the new fund. The article praised his intuition and boldness. It quoted unnamed experts who described him as a visionary. He liked these things less than people assumed. The media attention felt mostly like background noise, but it still mattered. The higher his visible status, the easier it became to pressure institutions, to influence opinions, to dismiss early doubts about any irregularities as envy or ignorance. Reputation was another asset, and he managed it carefully. The fact that it now rested on something hollow did not bother him. He had learned to separate his public figure from the inner calculations that actually ran his empire. At the office, the atmosphere was focused and tense, even on a day after a celebration. Analysts reviewed market conditions and adjusted outlooks. Lawyers handled documentation from investors who had missed the first deadline, but wanted to get in now. A few quieter employees processed data in small rooms where the windows never opened. Victor walked through the floor, noting how people stiffened slightly when he passed. He read their posture, their rushed smiles, their stiff necks. They respected him, but they were also afraid of him, and the mixture pleased him. One of the younger analysts, pale from lack of sleep, was working with a stack of reports on the new fund. Victor noticed the nervous way the young man's hand hovered near a folder marked with the name of the industrial park company. There was a list of payments projected to start within weeks. Some of those payments had nothing to do with actual construction. They were fees for consulting, marketing, and land preparation, paid to entities that existed mainly to receive and redirect. The analyst had scribbled a question mark in the margin next to two of these payments. It was a small symbol, almost insignificant. Victor saw it in a glance and understood immediately what it meant. A mind that had not yet accepted that this was how the game was played. He felt irritation. He did not want to spend energy calming anxious consciences in the lower ranks. But he also understood that anxious employees were potential leaks. Later that day, the analyst received an invitation to an informal meeting with the head of risk management. The conversation was polite and firm. The message was simple. Excessive curiosity about decisions taken at a higher level could lead to misunderstandings and career problems. The analyst left with a sense of unease and a printed agreement reminding him of confidentiality obligations. Within a month, he agreed to part ways with the company under a mutual termination agreement. He left with a compensation package and his own copies of certain files, stored quietly on a personal device. Victor did not know about the copies. He did not care. In his mind, the story had ended the day the employee's access to the company network was revoked. In another part of Moscow, far from the skyscrapers and private drivers, senior investigator Marina reviewed new complaints from citizens. The office of the investigative department had old furniture, humming air conditioners, and piles of files balanced in ways that looked unsafe. Her workday began with a routine: coffee from a machine that never produced the same taste twice, a short exchange of updates with colleagues, and then hours of documents, timelines, and traces of other people's choices. Marina specialized in economic crimes. She was used to reading about sums that did not exist as physical objects, numbers on screens, transfers between accounts, contracts that looked clean until one began to examine their logic. She often met people who had never touched the money they had lost. Their savings had traveled through systems in ways they barely understood. When they sat in her office, they brought printouts, thick folders, and a mixture of shame and indignation. Many of them were certain that no one would care about their situation. Her presence was the only visible answer from a state that moved slowly and spoke in forms and signatures. A file on her desk that week concerned an investment scandal in a provincial town. A group of teachers and small business owners had invested their savings into a complex financial product linked to infrastructure projects. The product promised stable returns and a chance to participate in the modernization of the country. The brochures featured images of newly built roads and industrial zones. The investors had received interest payments for a while, then nothing. The support line numbers no longer worked. The local manager disappeared. At first glance, the case looked like one of many small fraudulent structures that appeared on the margins of the financial sector. But the documents showed something that caught Marina's eye. On several pages, in the small print about partners and umbrella funds, one name appeared in different variants: Lebedev Capital, Lebedev Infrastructure Fund, LC Management. The name was familiar to her from the news and from other investigations that had never fully matured. In one old case, it had appeared in a file that was eventually closed because the evidence had been too fragmented and the political pressure too subtle to fight. She did not feel intimidated by big names. Over years of work, she had learned to ignore the aura around wealthy defendants. What interested her was patterns. She laid out the documents on her desk and began to draw lines on a sheet of paper. The small provincial product was formally independent, but its marketing materials quoted phrases from Lebedev Capital's presentations. The legal entity that had collected money from the teachers had a consulting agreement with a company connected to one of Lebedev's funds. Money had flowed briefly through an account that also appeared in another ongoing investigation. Marina requested additional information from the central bank and from financial monitoring services. She asked for transaction histories, names of beneficial owners, logs of cross-border transfers. The answers took time. While she waited, she continued with other cases, but the names stayed at the back of her mind, like a line in a half-finished equation. Weeks turned into months. In Victor's world, this period was filled with fast moves. He restructured parts of his group, reshuffled managers, closed an underperforming fund, opened a new one with a focus on green technologies. Press releases announced his participation in a charity project connected with urban development. His public image remained strong. He sat on panels, spoke about responsible investing, and received awards. Cameras captured him next to officials and celebrities. At the same time, he adjusted his schemes. Where older structures had become too visible, he wound them down and replaced them with new ones. He used front men and women who were grateful for the chance to appear successful. He distributed risk and responsibility across layers of companies and documents. His lawyers updated internal guidelines on compliance and risk management. Externally, nothing looked obviously wrong. Internally, the core not every transaction was dishonest. Enough real investments took place to maintain plausible performance. Some projects were built, some loans were repaid. This mixture, for a time, protected the structure from collapse. But every new round of aggressive extraction increased the dependence on continued trust. If that trust broke suddenly, there would not be enough real assets to calm the panic. One morning, Victor received an internal report that irritated him more than usual. The markets had moved against one of his positions. A project in a neighboring region had been delayed due to administrative conflicts. The fund connected to that project now showed tension between its obligations and its expected income. Normally, this would be manageable. They could use money from another vehicle to cover the gap. The problem was that the other vehicle was already overextended. He walked through this mental maze without showing anything on his face. In a closed meeting with a small group of trusted people, he proposed a solution: accelerate the diversion of capital from the newest infrastructure fund to cover the weak spots. It meant less buffer. It also meant that, if any regulator began to ask questions soon, the answers would have to be more creative. But he believed in his ability to manage questions. He viewed oversight institutions as slow and unimaginative. In the investigative department, Marina finally received a thick envelope with data she had requested months earlier. It contained logs of suspicious transactions connected to several funds and shell companies. Many of the paths ended in what looked like legitimate investments abroad. Some, however, circled back into accounts controlled by entities linked, one way or another, to Lebedev Capital. When she compared the dates of these transactions with public reports about the fund's performance, she saw misalignments. Money that was supposed to be used for construction had never reached any contractor. Instead, it had visited several jurisdictions in rapid succession. She did not jump to conclusions. Investigations into financial crimes required patience and humility before complexity. People with Victor's resources did not make simple errors. If there was wrongdoing, it would be wrapped in layers of legality. Marina created a working group with 2 other investigators and a financial analyst seconded from a regulatory agency. Together, they began to reconstruct chains of events. They talked to former employees of small firms that had gone bankrupt after cooperation with Lebedev projects. They interviewed the dismissed analyst who had once worked in Victor's office and left with a silent conviction that something had been wrong. The former analyst arrived with a cautious manner and a small backpack. He explained in a controlled voice that he had noticed payments to companies with no real activity. He had raised questions and had been advised to think about his future career. He had accepted a severance package and told himself to move on. The sense of guilt had followed him. At some point, he had copied certain files onto a flash drive, unsure of what he would do with them. Now, sitting in Marina's office, he felt a mixture of relief and fear as he handed over the device. The files contained internal presentations, correspondence, and payment schedules. Nothing in them directly admitted to a crime. However, they showed that key people at Lebedev Capital had known about the lack of real progress on certain projects while continuing to collect and redistribute funds. Marina and her team cross-referenced these materials with bank data. Bit by bit, a picture emerged of deliberate deception. The key piece was that the explanations offered to investors did not match the real movement of money. Promises in glossy brochures and webinars had been based on realities that, internally, no one planned to create. After a year of work, Marina's department opened a formal case. The decision triggered a series of procedures. Requests went to courts for warrants. Financial monitoring agencies were instructed to freeze certain accounts temporarily. The investigative team prepared plans for searches. Informally, word began to spread in narrow circles that a major figure was about to face pressure. Victor heard about the brewing storm indirectly at first. A bank manager, who had always been eager to impress him, became oddly cautious on the phone. A usually compliant auditor postponed a meeting with a vague reference to internal guidelines. A colleague at a business event mentioned, as if casually, that there were rumors about more aggressive oversight in the sector. Victor interpreted it as background noise. He had seen waves of regulatory activity before. He gave instructions to his legal department to prepare standard responses and to watch for any concrete information. He told himself that even if an investigation began, it could be contained. The first sign that this time would be different came early one morning when his gate intercom buzzed in a way that did not match any delivery or expected guest. Outside his house on the edge of the city, black cars waited, their engines idling. Officers showed warrants. In the rising light, neighbors watched through curtains as people in official jackets entered the property. Inside, the silence of expensive interiors filled with the sound of opening drawers, rustling paper, the click of computers being disconnected from desks. Victor stayed outwardly composed. He spoke in short, controlled phrases, insisting that he was ready to cooperate. He had dealt with inspections before. Some had even involved visits. This one, however, had a heavier rhythm. Officers collected not just formal documents, but also personal devices. They left with sealed boxes and drives. In his office later the same day, a similar scene unfolded. Employees were instructed to step away from their machines. The security staff, usually imposing, stood uncertainly near the elevators. Within days, Lebedev Capital's accounts faced temporary restrictions. Certain transactions were blocked. Clients began calling support lines. The company issued a public statement describing the events as a misunderstanding and expressing confidence in a quick resolution. Victor approved the wording personally, making sure it suggested that his group was a victim of bureaucratic excess, not a suspect in anything serious. He soon received a summons for questioning. The paper carried official letterheads and clear wording. He was expected to appear as part of an investigation into large-scale fraud and embezzlement. The maximum possible sentence, in theory, reached double digits in years. His lawyers advised him to treat the situation with maximum seriousness. They assured him that, with the right strategy, many charges could be softened or even avoided. They proposed narratives that shifted responsibility toward subordinate managers and external partners. In these narratives, Victor remained someone who trusted the wrong people. The first interview with Marina took place in a room that smelled of old paint and coffee. There were no cameras from the press, no audience, just a table, chairs, and documents. Victor's lawyer sat beside him, prepared to intervene when necessary. Marina presented the questions calmly with no aggression. She asked about specific funds, dates, and decisions. She showed bank statements and contracts. She described sequences in which money left investors' accounts, entered fund accounts, and then vanished into structures with no economic justification. Victor responded with controlled generalities. He described his role as strategic and high-level. He claimed limited knowledge of operational details. Whenever Marina's questions touched on payments to shell entities, he suggested that they had been part of standard risk management and consulting practices. The lawyer occasionally added notes about the complexity of modern finance and the possibility of misunderstandings. Inside, however, Victor felt a small, unfamiliar sensation, the realization that the person across from him had done her homework and was not impressed by the layers of formal legality. Marina did not expect a confession at this stage. Her goal was to catch inconsistencies and statements that could later be confronted with documentary evidence. She noted how Victor minimized his involvement in certain decisions, even though his digital signature appeared on internal resolutions. She observed how he referred vaguely to specialists who were either no longer with the company or were already giving testimony under different statuses. As months passed, the investigation widened. More witnesses came forward. Some had been pressured previously to stay silent. The freezing of accounts and the visible fall in Lebedev Capital's reputation changed their calculations. Former partners decided to protect themselves by cooperating. They admitted that they had signed documents at Victor's request, sometimes without fully understanding them. Their statements painted a picture of a structure in which Victor's will was decisive, even when it was hidden behind committees and procedures. Investors who had lost everything began to organize. Online communities formed around shared frustration and hope for justice. Marina and her colleagues could not promise quick financial restoration. The legal process of seizing and redistributing assets was slow. But the existence of a clear criminal case gave the victims a sense that their losses had not gone unnoticed. For Victor, the outer shell of his life started chipping away. The media, which once respected him unconditionally, shifted tone. Articles appeared that questioned the sustainability of his business model. Commentators, who had once praised him, now remembered earlier doubts. Photographs from conferences looked different when placed next to headlines about fraud allegations. Banks reviewed credit lines. One by one, they reduced exposure. His company's liquidity tightened. Projects that depended on continued financing stalled. He tried to mount a counteroffensive. His communications team released materials about the jobs his group had created and the taxes it had paid. His lawyers filed complaints about investigative actions, accusing the authorities of overreach. Private meetings took place with people who still owed him favors. Some of these contacts offered sympathetic words. Few offered real help. No one wanted to be too close to a possible scandal of this size. Eventually, the investigation concluded that there was enough evidence to bring formal charges. An indictment was prepared, detailing counts of large-scale fraud, embezzlement of funds entrusted by investors, and laundering of criminal proceeds through a network of controlled entities. The document was thick and technical, but it boiled down to a simple assertion. Victor and several associates had knowingly created and operated structures that lied to investors and stole their money. The case went to court. The trial attracted attention. Journalists requested accreditation to the hearings. Supporters of stricter enforcement in the financial sector saw the process as a test. Business circles watched nervously, wondering whether this was a targeted example or a sign of broader changes. On the first day of the trial, Victor walked up the steps of the courthouse under the eyes of cameras. He wore a suit and carried himself with practiced dignity. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old wood and human presence. The judge, seated high, opened the proceedings with formal words. The prosecution laid out its case, projecting charts and timelines onto a screen. The defense listened and took notes. Victor's expression remained controlled, but his fingers occasionally tightened around a pen. Witnesses took turns on the stand. Former investors told their stories. Teachers, small entrepreneurs, a retired engineer who had put his savings into the fund because he believed that supporting infrastructure projects was patriotic and safe. They described how the promised returns had stopped, how customer support had given them rehearsed explanations, how, in the end, they had realized that the money was gone, and the objects they had financed did not exist outside of brochures. Former employees described internal practices. They explained how reports had been massaged to hide delays, how consultants with no real activity had been paid large sums, how decisions always seemed to follow Victor's preferences even when formal protocols suggested collective responsibility. None of them claimed that they had been forced at gunpoint. Instead, they spoke of pressure, hints, and a culture in which questioning the logic of orders threatened one's livelihood. The defense tried to attack their credibility. Lawyers pointed to inconsistencies in memories, to possible personal motives for revenge. They argued that failures in investments did not automatically mean criminal intent. They reminded the court that markets were risky and that losses were not unusual. They insisted that Victor had relied on the expertise of others and had never intended to steal. Marina, when called to describe the investigation, spoke in measured, precise terms. She explained how her team had followed the money. She described patterns that could not be explained by market risk alone: transfers to companies with no employees, immediate withdrawals of funds into personal accounts of trusted collaborators, misrepresentation of the progress of projects to justify continued fundraising. She did not raise her voice. The weight came from the accumulation of details. It became harder, as the trial went on, for Victor to maintain the narrative he had chosen. Under questioning, he had to acknowledge that he had signed documents authorizing some of the key transactions. He admitted that he had been aware of serious obstacles to the construction of flagship projects, yet had allowed marketing materials to present these projects as nearly ready. He attempted to frame his conduct as overly optimistic risk-taking. The prosecution countered with internal memos that used colder language about the unlikelihood of implementation. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted further against him. Reports showed images of abandoned fields where industrial parks had been promised. They compared the luxurious life he had enjoyed to the financial struggles of people who had believed in his promises. The narrative of a self-made genius no longer fit. A different story took shape, that of a man who had used the complexity of modern finance to hide simple greed. When the time came for the verdict, the courtroom filled to capacity. The judge read the decision in a neutral voice, but the content was severe. The court found Victor guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement committed by an organized group. It recognized the scale of the damage and the systematic nature of the deception. The sentence included a long term of imprisonment in a penal colony, significant fines, and the confiscation of assets identified as acquired through criminal means. He was also barred from holding leadership positions in any financial or commercial organization for a long period after his release. The words landed like a physical impact. Victor's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, the image of the city view from his former office flashed in his mind, the sound of champagne corks, the easy laughter of colleagues. That world now lay behind a closed door. There would be appeals, his lawyers assured him, but the core of the change had already taken place. From that moment, he was not a respected businessman fighting an administrative misunderstanding. He was a convicted criminal. In the following weeks, the practical consequences unfolded. He was transferred from pre-trial detention to a penal colony in a distant region. The journey happened without cameras, in a secure vehicle, along roads he once crossed in a different context. The colony itself did not resemble the imaginings of movies. It was more prosaic and, in its own way, harsher. Routine, lack of privacy, constant control, repetitive tasks, and the slow erosion of individuality. Victor now lived in a shared barrack. The bed was narrow, the mattress was thin. His personal belongings fit into a small space. The expensive watches and tailored suits were gone, sold under enforced procedures to contribute to the compensation fund for victims. He wore a uniform that was the same as everyone else's. The first weeks were a shock, not only because of the physical discomfort, but because of the sudden absence of deference in the eyes around him. No one cared that he had once appeared on magazine covers. Work in the colony involved simple production tasks. He repeated the same motions for hours. The monotony left room for thoughts he had long suppressed. At first, he tried to frame his situation as an accident, a miscarriage of justice, a result of envy and political calculations. Over time, as appeals failed and the reality of years ahead solidified, this narrative lost its power. The facts did not change just because he rejected them. The investors' names remained on lists of victims. The sum of damages remained large, even after the forced sale of his assets. Meanwhile, outside, the system he had manipulated began to adjust. The collapse of his group sent waves through regulators and markets. Some funds were dissolved. Their remains were taken over by other managers under stricter oversight. New rules were introduced for the marketing of complex products. The case of Lebedev Capital entered training materials for financial inspectors and investigators as an example of how sophisticated structures could hide straightforward theft. Marina continued working. After the case against Victor, she received recognition inside her institution. For her, the outcome was not a personal triumph, but a confirmation that persistence mattered, even when she faced well-resourced opponents. She knew that many economic crimes never reached such a visible resolution. However, the Lebedev case gave her a reference point in conversations with victims who came to her office with skeptical eyes. She could now point, not with words, but with the existence of the verdict, to a precedent. Some of the investors received partial compensation from the sale of Victor's confiscated property and from a special fund created after political debates. The sums rarely covered all their losses. A teacher who had invested her savings into the infrastructure fund told friends that at least she could now plan again, even if her plans were smaller. A small business owner adjusted his retirement expectations, but felt a strange satisfaction when he read that Victor was serving his term far from the city lights. In Moscow City, another company eventually rented Victor's former office. The glass walls still faced the same view. New executives walked the same polished floors. They read new documents and made new decisions. On the wall where a painting had once hung as a sign of taste and wealth, there was now a more modest piece of art. The people who worked there knew the story of their predecessors. Internal compliance training used the Lebedev scandal as an example of what their company would avoid at all costs. In the penal colony, years acquired a rhythm. Victor became another person in the rows during roll call. He learned to move within unwritten rules that had nothing to do with shareholder agreements or acquisition deals. The skills that had made him powerful in the corporate world had limited use here. Manipulation and charm had some value, but they did not restore freedom. He had to negotiate, not contracts, but basic matters of living with others in close quarters. There were moments, late at night, when he recalled specific faces: the analyst who had left with questions in his eyes, the investors who had taken photographs with him at celebratory events, the old engineer who had proudly told him about investing in the future of the country. He remembered them not as abstractions, but as individuals whose trust he had weighed against his own desires and found expendable. These memories did not bring immediate remorse. His mind resisted that, but they chipped at the hardened justification that he had carried. He could no longer fully believe that everyone in his position would have acted the same way. The moral of his story did not arrive as a neat lesson in his own head. It formed outside of him, in the way society retold what he had done and what had happened to him. Journalists wrote long articles analyzing the case. Commentators in financial media pointed out that greed combined with a sense of impunity had led to a collapse that hurt many and destroyed one man's life in return. Legal scholars highlighted the importance of institutional independence, noting that investigators and judges had withstood attempts at pressure. In one training session for newly hired investigators, Marina spoke briefly about her experience. She recounted the slow accumulation of evidence, the importance of following every small incongruity, the necessity of resisting both intimidation and fatigue. She described how, in the early stages, the case had looked almost too big to touch, but how each step had been manageable when broken down into specific actions. She did not dwell on Victor as a personality. She focused on the patterns of behavior that could emerge whenever someone with power decided that other people's money was a resource to be harvested without accountability. Years later, when Victor neared the end of his sentence, the world outside had moved on. The financial sector had produced new stars and new scandals. Some of them were smaller, some similar in scale. Regulations had become somewhat tighter, yet creativity in finding loopholes remained. Human nature in the realm of money had not changed dramatically. But in databases, in legal archives, in the memories of thousands of people, the story of Lebedev Capital remained as a marker. When he was finally released, his return to civilian life was quiet. There were no cameras. There was no driver waiting with a luxury car. He stepped out with a small bag of belongings, dressed in clothes that had been given to him. His face had aged beyond the natural passage of time. Freedom, in this new form, felt heavier than the routines of incarceration. He had to think about practical things that he had not considered in decades: where to live, how to earn a living within the restrictions still applying to him, how to navigate a city where his name was associated less with admiration and more with a lesson in what not to do. He rented a modest apartment on the outskirts. To those who met him casually, He was just another middle-aged man with a neutral manner. If they learned his surname and connected it to the past, they sometimes looked at him with a curiosity that blended contempt and fascination. No one treated him as an authority. No one asked him for investment advice. The illusion of untouchability that had once surrounded him had evaporated. The consequences of his earlier actions remained visible not only in his own life, but in the lives he had affected. Some of his victims never fully recovered financially. They adapted in other ways, taking second jobs, moving to smaller homes, postponing plans. Their stories had moved past daily anger and settled into a quiet conviction that trust without transparency was dangerous. Some of them became more active in public discussions about financial literacy. A few participated in community efforts that tried to educate others about risks. The harshness of Victor's punishment lay not only in the years spent behind bars, but in the disproportional contrast between the person he had once considered himself to be and the person he had become in the eyes of society. He had pursued wealth and status with the assumption that they would shield him from consequences. In the end, they had only made his fall more visible and more instructive. The story of his rise and fall circulated as a cautionary narrative. It was told in classrooms, in small investor clubs, in conversations between young professionals tempted to cut corners. It showed that sophisticated structures and expensive suits did not change the basic logic. When a person chooses to exploit others for personal gain, the damage spreads widely, and the eventual price can strip away everything that was gained and more. In that sense, the ending of his story was harsh but clear. There was no redemption arc that erased the harm. There was only the fact that the law had reached him and had done so in a way that respected procedure rather than emotion. The teachers and small business owners did not get all their money back, yet they saw the person who had deceived them face consequences instead of moving on to new ventures without interruption. The investigator who had patiently followed the trails saw her work confirm that sometimes accountability could be real. Victor's name turned into a reference point for future debates about regulation and ethics. He was no longer the symbol of daring financial genius. He had become a reminder that greed, combined with the belief in one's own special status, led not to lasting glory, but to collapse and disgrace. The towers of Moscow City continued to shine at night. In their reflections, new faces came and went. Behind some of those faces, familiar temptations lived on. Yet there was also the memory of one man who had believed that he was above everyone else, and who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that no wealth and no carefully constructed image could protect him from the reality of what he had done.